Good evening. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to be talking about scriptural citations and subjective analysis. And let's contrast subjective analysis, where you're talking about your thoughts, your feelings, your reactions, from literary analysis, where you're primarily trying to talk about things that are hopefully more objective, where you're trying to understand what the original authors were saying or the translators, what they meant by things. And these are sometimes very closely related and sometimes quite different, as we'll see soon. So, with no further ado, let's take a look at our learning objectives today. We're going to start by looking at how to cite and reference the Bible in APA style. We're going to look at our catalyst for discussion, BCMO 311's Week 1 assignment, number 1, Pastoral Ministry Images. And then we'll talk about how to ground subjective writing with biblical citations in APA style and dig into what that means. Now, first, let's get this out of the way. There are two ways that you might be citing and referencing the Bible in APA style. There is the formal sense when we are following all of the rules, and we have a link here to how to do that. And there's also an informal one where we just reference the book, chapter, and verse. Now, the formal sense that we see on this slide is treating all religious works alike, just as we would any other source where the exact who wrote this down, what might in a more recent book be the editor or the authors who exactly penned that is not clear to us. The exact identities of who did what work for the King James Bible translation is not known. And it's the same thing with the Bhagavad Gita, who wrote it down in the original language first. And so for these sources, we cite it as we do another work where we don't have that authorship and we just put the title first. Now, if you're citing that, again, in this very formal style, you'll have parenthetical citations like you see at the bottom. Parentheses, the Bhagavad Gita in italics, comma, 2007. 2000 being the date of this specific translation's publication. King James Bible, 1769, 2017. So 1769 is when this particular edition was published. 2017 is when the website here, this online version, was published. And there are other things that the website has that are not in the original, like, hey, helpful explanations and things like that, which is why we're citing the specific online version. Now, when you are citing a chapter or verse, one thing about these documents is that you have canonical, in this case, internationally agreed divisions of the Bible into things like books, the book of the Acts of Apostles, the book of the first book of Samuel, the Song of Solomon, and so on and so forth. If you just joined us, we're just starting to dive into our discussion of learning objective 1, starting with how you would cite and reference the Bible in APA style. And again, there is this formal sense where you have this written out thing, but if you're not quoting the exact text, then you can also just refer to it using a shorthand with reference to the book and chapter and verse, as you see at the bottom of the slide. Now, many professors will, as a house rule, say you can just do what you see on this slide, because if you're not referring to a specific translation of it, well, again, internationally agreed divisions of the Bible into different books, chapters, and verses. So 2 Corinthians 1, verses 4 to 7, John chapter 3, verse 16, Genesis chapter 5, verses 3 to 7. Those are all internationally agreed what that is, what that represents. Now, with that said, if you're quoting the Bible, we do need to refer to the translation. And this is where we, again, have the formal written out version here, that if you were, say, publishing a master's thesis with your essays on this, you would want to use this most formal version. But if you are just writing a paper, most professors will say, look, it's less distracting if you just use the internationally agreed abbreviation because they're used in most of the literature on this topic. And by the translation, I'm referring to these things. So New International Version is the specific name. We abbreviate that as NIV. New Revised Standard Version, NRSV. In almost all cases, it's just taking the first letter of each word in the name. And in rare cases where there is overlap, you can look that up and just search for biblical translation, that name and abbreviation, and it'll come up. Now, which translation is the best depends on what you're doing and what you like about it. I find the New Revised Standard Version very accurate, but also kind of boring to read. And I'll admit that I do like the sound of the King James Version. It just sounds like beautiful poetry. So if I have my choice, usually I'll be reading from the translation that I feel is more evocative. But if you're doing a scholarly discussion, you might be looking for one that emphasizes certain things because translations are almost always making trade-offs. And some of that's about the clarity or the accessibility of the imagery. And sometimes that's about, okay, here's this word and there isn't a direct analog in this language. How do we translate that? And in the church that I work at on Sundays, the pastor will go back and forth between different translations because that particular congregation does allow that. And they talk about the virtues of the different translations and why they like one versus the other. All right. So let's continue on here and look at this example here. So when you're discussing the Bible, discussing the text itself, you might be quoting it because there's a specific aspect that you want to point out. And here you might have something like Philippians 2-3. That's Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. Philippians 2:3 states, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility value others above yourself. Close quote, parentheses, NIV. And I want to point out here that we have, in this case, we have the chapter, verse, and book all given at the beginning. So the only thing left to do is to give the translation at the end because we got the, oh, where do you find that earlier. Now, that doesn't stop you from having something more elaborate like this version here, but that is, again, the formal, if you're, say, publishing this in a scholarly journal, most professors allow and encourage their students to use this slightly more simplified one just because it's often considered more readable. Okay, so when we're looking at this, there are also some conventions that you might want to be aware. In most things in APA style, we refer to what authors said and did in the past tense. For religious texts, generally speaking, the convention is to use present tense to say, hey, Genesis 5, verses 3-5 states, whatever it does, close quote, parentheses, the translation. So we refer to it using present tense. And if we're quoting from the Bible, we want to have the translation abbreviation. If you're just referring to the content, but you're not quoting, you don't need to list the translation because you're not highlighting that particular wording. Now, if you have a question about how to cite and reference the Bible, by all means, send us a question. You can contact us at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu or just sign up for an appointment to get more detailed feedback. On to our second learning objective. We're going to look at some aspects of this assignment from BCMO 311. So this is the Pastoral Ministry Images assignment. And if we delve into that, we find that it begins with a preamble. The role of the pastor is often presented using metaphoric imagery, such as shepherd. In this assignment, students will explore several of these images, the strengths and limitations of each, and locate the pastoral image which describes their current ministry. Okay, And then we have some background about the reading with the 8 images of pastoral ministry. And then you're going to be asked to chart those and do a strengths and weakness analysis. And it happens that that's going to be done using a table format with 8 rows and 5 columns. All right. And we have this here. So let's go ahead and pop up a Word document and walk through just this thing. All right, so I've got a blank Word document here that I'm going to go ahead and share. And we're going to just walk through these instructions here. All right, so the first instruction says to create a chart. In this case, chart is synonymous with table. We're going to create a chart or table that has 8 rows and 5 columns. Now there are a couple of different ways that you can start this in Word. Let's go to Insert here, and we can select Table, because that gives us this handy table tool. You can see by moving my mouse, I can say, oh, 5 columns, 8 rows, and click on that. And now we have 5 columns and 8 rows. And then the next instruction says, title the columns. Well, that's very straightforward. Image, explanation, strengths, weaknesses, and rating. Now we have 8 images that we need to discuss. So let's go ahead and add one more row. So it's the title row, and then the 8 rows to insert the content. Great. Now, if you are writing this in APA style, there are a few more things that you'd want to do. One is that we need to label this. So this is going to be table 1, and then we're going to call it, all right, Willimon's Images of Pastoral Ministry, because that is describing what it is. Note that the table is called table 1 because it's the first one in the document. We have a descriptive title here in italics and title case. And then we have this here. Now, we have one more step to do here, which is in APA style, you will want to go ahead and remove most of the vertical and horizontal lines. I'm just going to type something into each row really quick so that you can see what this looks like a little more clearly. So we've just put in some placeholder stuff. You can type things later, but we want to select the whole table and then right click or control click if you're on a Mac and select borders and shading. And up here where it says setting, none. And then we're going to use this box to turn on borders for our selection. A border at the very top of it, a border at the bottom. And now we only have a line above and below. We'll select this top row. And again, control click or right click if you're on a Mac and select borders and shading. And we're going to use this button here to add a bottom border to our selection. You can see that now we have horizontal lines just above and below the header row and at the very bottom of the table, and no other spaces, because that's how a table is formatted in APA style. Now you can replace all these little placeholders with the things that you're putting in. For example, ratings here, 1, 3, 2, 4, 5, 5, 5, 5, or whatever it is that you're putting in. And in fact, you could go back and immediately put in all of the images that are listed in the course reading here. The explanation, strengths, and weaknesses, you'll probably want to review the reading, but this you can set up and put that in before you even start the reading. You just need to find the list of those in the book. All right, now let's head on back over to PowerPoint and let's take a look at some of the things that we're talking about. So one of the questions that we're going to have is, what do we do when we have something that is not going to be in this table? Well, that's an excellent question to be asking, because as it happens, That's the next part of the assignment. So let's go ahead and again, head back to PowerPoint, and we're going to take a look at what's going on here. There we go. All right, so we have this instruction. The Bible is full of metaphorical images of pastors, especially in regard to God as the ultimate nurturer of souls. Pastoral ministry is imaged in the Bible as shepherd in John 10, overseer in Acts 20:28, and a few other examples. And so you're asked to identify and read some of these with thinking back to those 8 images that are in the Willimon text. And in your mind, you need to determine which pastoral metaphors describe your ministry and which do not. We even have this guiding in text here. Note the distinction between metaphors for God, like rock and potter, versus metaphors for pastors. A pastor cannot be a potter, for example. Well, but she or he can be the potter's wheel that holds up the clay for the potter to mold. Now, this sentence is an interesting one because many people do like the image of a potter as shaping their flock. But in this case, it's saying contrasting the language in the Bible for God and the language in the Bible for pastors. So this is not talking about what might happen in the congregation. This is talking about what language you are seeing in the Bible. All right, now note that so far it's not telling you what to write. That's coming up next. Formulate an image for your pastoral ministry as you are embodying it today. It might be one that Willimon or Scripture offered, but more likely it will be something that you create, like a tugboat with a searchlight or an eccentric city planner. No metaphor is a bad one as long as you explain it. So that's the instructor saying, hey, there's no right or wrong, but there can be insufficient evidence and argumentation to support your claim. And then we have the second part besides the table. 500 words, that's going to be about 2 double-spaced pages using our course paper template. 2 double-spaced pages where you say what your image is, to explain why it describes your pastoral ministry, list the strengths and weaknesses of this metaphor, and answer this question: is this an image that honors the work of God? Now, how you're going to answer that, that's going to be about your personal reading, your personal reaction. And that is something that you might be guiding with reference to the Bible. So looking at this, we see we have the rubric saying, hey, you do need that table or chart that has those things in it. You need to have your metaphor image. Now, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So when you say formulate an image, is this metaphorical? Is this going to be an actual image? Now, if it is an actual image, well, let's go with that because it says a metaphor image chosen from the internet or originally created. Okay, well, you could find one through a couple means. Let's go ahead and hop onto Google image search. So with this, let's go to our web browser. And I'm just typing in my search bar, Google Images. All right. You could also go to Google and go to the Images tab. But either way, we're going to end up with a search here. And maybe your metaphor for pastoring is, to pick an example here, a tree sheltering a flock of sheep. Okay, well, we've got lots of pictures here that we might choose from and incorporate here. You might also, in this day and age, you might use an image generator. I'm using one called Copilot, which is something free to anyone who has Microsoft Office. So as an ACU student, you can get a free license, and you can also free license to Microsoft Office. You can also use it to use Copilot and say, oh, draw a tree sheltering a flock of sheep. Now, image generators are an interesting thing that you don't always get what you're looking for, but if you give it a couple tries, you'll probably find something that might be appealing to you. And again, this is a catalyst for discussion. So let's see what it comes up here. By the way, if you are wondering how to cite an image that you have generated, there we have a whole webinar on that, as well as the slides that serve as a quick guide. But if I look at this, I zoom and I say, okay, that's enough to show what I have in mind. So I'm just going to copy this, and let's head over to the Word document again. So I've got my table here, and now I'm going to have an image. And when you are adding images in APA style, those are formally called figures. We'll do the description in a moment. So we want, just like with the table, we want to have a descriptive title here. All right, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. So right now this is pretty large. We're going to shrink that a little bit so we can look at it on one page. And so what is this? We'll call it an AI generated now in APA style, the titles or captions of images do not have to be poetic. What they should be is clear and accurate. And this is definitely describing the image here. Now, if we go back to those instructions, we see something that is important. This note here, a metaphor image, either chosen from the internet, ... with a footnote that defines it. Ah, okay. So footnote in this case means text below the image. So if we head back to Word, we have some things to consider now here. All right. So do we want to just call it an AI generated image, or should we label it as a metaphor image, because that's what the instructions, the rubric, are saying has to be in there. And if we label this, it's pretty clear we are providing that thing that was asked for. And now for our note, we're going to go ahead and add here. In this image, the tree symbolizes my pastoral ministry, and the sheep symbolize people that I will minister to. And you can call it whatever you want, so long as it is telling us what these things mention and what they represent, and perhaps, if needed, some explanation of it. Like you might add more text explaining what the shade is standing in for, but I'll leave it up to you. Now, there is the question of how you might cite this. So I mentioned we have a webinar about citing AI images. So let's take a look over on the Writing Center website, and I'll share this link in the chat here. So on our webpage, you will find that there are a lot of webinars here that we're doing this term. There's also a tabbed guide here that you can search by course. So if you're, say, looking for other BCMO courses, just click on that and you can see all the tie-ins there. But in our case, we are going to do a word search. And you'll see that there's a webinar here about AI image generation and how to cite it. We could watch the video, but actually, I think if we just look at the slides, we'll find what I'm looking for here. So scrolling down, we see, okay, we need to have a reference for whatever we're using. Here's one for Copilot. We want to update the date to our thing, but we just cite it referring to author, date. Great. So I'm actually going to just copy and paste this right now and then do my update in Word. Now, if you are working in Word here and you see, hold on, there we go. So you're working in Word, and if you're using your template, you'll have this already. If not, if you're adding all these things by yourself, you'll need to add a heading for references and then paste here. And we're going to need to add the reference style. So that's going to be APA reference. We need to have the title of the product, Copilot. And in this case, we are working on May 7th, so that will be the May 7th version. And that's all we need for our reference. But for a note, we should include great. So we've got our image, we've cited it in APA style, acknowledging that it was created. And now we have the step of writing that 500-word essay. Okay, so we have a set of prompts. Let's go ahead and paste those in here. Now, something I'm going to do is change all this to follow our required formatting in APA style. So we're going to go ahead and apply the body text style from our template. And now we have a list of items we want to create. And so you can use this as a checklist for making sure that you put all the things that you need in here. So reveal your image. You can do this with words or graphic design with a caption. The best option is to create the image yourself. Great, we did that over here. All right, so what should we do next? Well, we've got 500 words to describe this, so let's get started. And in fact, we're going to go ahead and take this and move it up here and start. All right, now why the image describes your pastoral ministry? We have the short version here. We have a longer one here. Now in APA style, you should always introduce a figure or a table before it appears. So we put that there. And so now we can continue with the why the image describes. And then you're going to want to have some supporting examples for that. I don't know what they're going to be, but probably 3 or 4, your evidence and argumentation. And metaphor, strength, and weaknesses. Okay, well, that's telling us we need to have a strengths section and a weaknesses section. One of the reasons you want to do up this outline is it gives you an idea of how much detail you should put into each section so you don't write too much or too little or run out of room. Now, what you'll put in there, I don't know, but you need to start by answering the question and then backing that up with evidence and argumentation. And this is where we move to the subjective area. So let's head on back to our slides now. Because our goal is to understand how to ground subjective writing with biblical citations in APA style. Now, if we're just talking about a commentary, what other people have said, you'd use standard author date citations, much like you see here. Psalm 74 is considered a, quote, communal lament, close quote, because it describes a crisis that affected a whole community, namely the destruction of the temple, author, date, page number. Pretty simple. But we're talking about what things mean to you. And so rather than reading someone else's biblical commentary, let's focus on the difference between literary analysis and subjective analysis. Because in literary analysis, we're trying to focus on the text itself and understand the structure, the language, the themes, the symbols, the historical context. Now, I was fortunate that when I was in seminary, I studied with the late Dr. Simon B. Parker, who was a fantastic scholar of the Hebrew Bible. And one of the things that he studied was the parallel language between these Ugaritic and Assyrian and Sumerian tablets that had these treaties between rulers and the people that they ruled. And you'd see the same types of language being used to describe the relation with the things they understood as their gods. And he was one of several scholars who pointed out the very strong parallels in this language with what we'd find in the so-called covenants or treaties between God and his people in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the book of Genesis. And one of the things about this is that it says, oh, well, based on what we know about these other things, this helps us understand what the language in the Bible meant to the people who originally wrote it down and heard it and understood it. So that's the kind of literary analysis, because the symbols, the context is very key. But if you're doing a subjective analysis, it's about how you feel about that, what it represents to you now, which is not necessarily what it meant to the original people. A classic example, let's say you have a language about the bread of life and wheat. And imagine how that might read if we take it very, very literally to someone who has celiac and can't eat wheat. Does that cut you out of the bread of life? Well, if we're taking a literal look at it, which may not be representative of what literary analysis shows us, a very literal reading might produce a subjective result where they feel that they're being excluded. And the important thing here is that when we are doing subjective analysis, that you explain what the response is, where that is coming from, or how it's being shaped, and what these emotional reactions mean to you and other people. So again, let's contrast literary analysis, asking questions like, what does the text mean? And how is that affected by things like, say, character, plot, imagery, symbolism, and genre? Who wrote it? Because that's a huge part of understanding what they meant. Who was the intended audience? Same thing. And what was the original context? Now, in contrast, if we're doing subjective analysis, we're focusing on things like, what's your personal reaction? Is it emotional or logical or both? Do you care about who wrote it and why? Why do you have the reactions you do to this text? And what repercussions will these things have in your life? Now, let's back up a moment and look at the short rubric description of the essay explores the metaphor, its strengths and weaknesses, and how it aligns with God's will for your ministry. So that's definitely subjective because you could read the same passage of text and it could speak a very different thing. And this is something that was well understood in the Middle Ages. There was a interesting tradition called trial by Bible. You take a Bible, hold it up so that it's closed but raised, and then let it fall so that it will open as the sides hit the table or whatever you put it on. And the idea is that it will open and then God will guide someone's eyes to a passage that will speak whatever God wants to speak. And one of the really fascinating things about trial by Bible is it actually worked really well at some things. It would open, and let's say it was a case where someone had lied about something, and they see a passage about sinners must repent and confess. And someone would read that and be like, ah, it's true. I made everything up. And again, that was a subjective reading, but it was important to them. And understanding that process helps us understand what that image means to you and how you understand your ministry, however it is now, or perhaps how you wish, hope, or feel called to evolve and change that. So when we are talking about analyzing the Bible, you have questions of goals. And you're probably doing less the things on this slide when you're thinking about what it means to you. That doesn't mean you can't mix the two. I certainly appreciate all the literary analysis of the Bible that I've read. Um, is it something that I'm thinking about actively all the time? Depends. And that's probably true of you, where some things you might have that yearning to delve into the literary part, and other times it's pure subjective. So you can mix those. And you might have something like, in times of large scale disaster, like a global pandemic, turning to Psalm 74 provides me with solace. And then you talk about whatever the elements of that are. And that could include having a reference to scholarship, where they do the literary analysis. But for this assignment, it's probably going to be more about why that gives you solace. And there, if you're referring to the Bible, well, of course, you need to list chapter, book and chapter at least, or book, chapter, and verse. But beyond that, you're describing your feelings, your thoughts, and that doesn't need to have citations because no one has read your mind and written it down in a book in most cases. So let's talk about a couple examples, and we'll use these illustrations to more or less bring us home for this webinar. So back to our Word document. So how might you react to some of these things? Well, let's pick a passage in the Bible. And a way that you might do this is to just take a website like Bible Gateway, which has many different translations of the Bible accessible for free, and type in a word that is appealing to you. So you might search for tree. All right, we got a lot of results in the New International Version here. We've got 257. And look for a passage that speaks to you. Now, probably Genesis is not our best example here just because of the Garden of Eden stuff. But we're going to look ahead and see this language. A tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. And you might say, oh, to me, this speaks to me. I believe that I should be one of those trees providing fruit, things that belong to the Lord. Doesn't matter what passages that speaks to you, so long as it speaks to you, and then you explain it in this essay. So let's say I'm going to be referencing this in my paper. Okay, well, back to Word. I chose the imagery of a tree sheltering sheep because of the strong resonance of Leviticus 27:30 to my ministry. Strong resonance with my ideas of ministry. Now, I don't know which ideas will speak to you, but when you were writing about it, we have grounding the discussion, this imagery, and saying, oh, here's the passage of the Bible that I'm referring to, and unpacking why do you like that? And your answer might be, I don't know. It just is imagery that I love. Okay, well, write that down and tell us that. Let's do another one here. So one of the interesting variations in different biblical translations is what fruit they list. And sometimes that's because a particular area or people or country that was producing a translation, they adapted it to things that were familiar to them, or that something had was not known what that fruit was in the original text. And so we're going to say, okay, well, let's insert something that sounds plausible or that our readers will recognize because it's probably not about it specifically being an apple, for example. Well, let's say if we were to search for cherry, doesn't come up here. All right, let's see, we searched in the New Century version, doesn't come up here. All right, let's search in all of them. Nothing. Well, cherries, I guess, aren't going farther. But what if we search for apple? Now we've got some things. And so we might say, oh, I like this imagery of the right word spoken at the right time is as beautiful as gold apples in a silver bowl. Maybe that's what you created your image for. In fact, let's go and create one here. Now, I don't know what this image generator will come because, again, sometimes you have to do things. Oh, and we have a limit here. So hold on, I'm going to generate this with another piece of software. So give me just a moment. All right, so we are going to be working in Photoshop today, which is another handy thing that you have access to for free as a ACU student. So let's go ahead and here I can just say generate image and it will ask me what I want. And I'm going to say draw a painting of gold apples in a silver bowl on a table with a red damask tablecloth. And we'll see what it brings up here. Now, one of the reasons you might want to use a program like Photoshop, besides not having a one-page limit, is that it will not only make things like this here, but we have 3 variations to pick from. And I could always just hit generate if I wanted to make even more to pick from. So let's say you had one of these and you're like, ooh, those apples are beautiful. And they're being presented in a silver dish, which it has all this lovely things. And look at that tablecloth. And you say, okay, this is the one I want. All right, well, in this case, I'm going to grab this, stick it in the Word document, and in this case, it would be substituting for that earlier one here. And so we're discussing this, and so we might have the image here. And now you'd only have one according to this, so it would also be figure one, just we wouldn't have this stuff up above. So figure one, and then again, it's going to be titled metaphor image. And this is going to be now, you'll notice that I didn't mention the tablecloth. And that's because in the passage that I'm choosing to take as inspiration here, this reads, "The right word spoken at the right time is as beautiful as gold apples in a silver bowl." Okay. And again, the fact that you're referencing the Bible here is giving a starting point for the discussion. It's all the explanation, the unpacking, the references to why you believe this, the explanations for why this is important or how you believe it will guide things. It's all the follow-up that is really so important. So don't just say, well, I picked this because of X. Tell us more about what that means. And remember, you're going to be filling 2 pages here of text. So you have the opportunity to go into some detail. Um, and each of these prompts in the assignment is going to have some subjective explanation, like the why this describes your pastoral ministry. Okay, I think that's about all the time we have for today. So let's move into review. What have we talked about so far? Well, in the last 50 minutes, we started with a discussion of, hold on, back to those slides. There we go. So we started with the discussion of how to cite and reference the Bible in APA style. When you're doing an assignment about ministry, it's probably grounded in some way, a shape, or form in Christian ministry with the Bible. So it's good to be able to refer to that correctly and accurately, both for the points and because it is the foundation of many people's faith and a language that you can share with others. So we looked at how to cite and reference the Bible. We also looked at this assignment with its 3 different portions. The table, we looked at the image creation, how to cite that in APA style, and how to discuss the image and how to discuss passages in the Bible subjectively, contrasting that literary analysis and literary context and the subjective analysis that you're being asked to do, to talk about your personal feelings, opinions, and interpretations of perhaps the Bible well as text, perhaps the imagery in the image that you have generated, but asking those questions and answering, this is my personal reaction to the text. This is emotional or logical or some mixture of those. Here's what I care about this and why I believe this is meaningful in this way to me, and how that might have repercussions on the rest of your life. Now, going back to the instructions for this assignment, looking at the essay, reveal your image. That's basically tell us, show us, explain why the image describes your pastoral ministry. So, okay, what are the things in it that say things, and what are those things being said? Because by itself, that picture of apples on a dish is just a pretty picture. It's the things that you point out as important and you explain how and why they're important that gives us a deeper meaning. And then that metaphor may be stronger or weaker. Apples do go bad. Are those golden apples things you can eat? Or are they just gold? Is that helpful or not helpful for some? Does the imagery of gold exclude or excite? Or I don't know. Talk about what the strengths and weaknesses are to you and how you see those being potentially important to others. And finally, asking that question to yourself, is this an image that you believe honors the work God has entrusted to you? And I don't know, many people have what they feel are chapters in their lives when they are called to different things and do different things and want different things and need different things. And that might be something where you say, this is where I am now, but it's not where I want to be. So tell us about that. And if you're making reference to the reading, just remember to keep your author date citations in there so it's clear exactly what you're referring to. With that, if you have any questions, please feel free to email onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. You can go to my.acu.edu and under groups, select the Online Writing Center for scheduling an appointment. Visit our website, and you can also fill out this feedback form, which I'll share the link in the chat. And with that, I'll say thank you for joining us. Have a good night.